Okay, we should be good to go now. All right, everyone, please welcome Chaz from Georgia Tech, who's going to be talking to us about a lustrum of malware network communication, evolution, and insights.
Awesome. All right. Can you guys hear me out there? Great. Awesome. So this was just this will teach me to bring a MacBook to Microsoft. That does not. No, y'all taught me. I learned. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about a study we did, and we'll give you a little bit of like GRE vocab refresh. So Lustrum up here, a period of 5 years. So we're going to look at basically like a half-decade study looking at about 27 million malware samples and some of the insights and stuff that we caught over that period of time. And so I'm going to skip through some of these earlier slides a little bit quickly because I'm guessing you guys already know what malware is. So I'm not going to go over that, but we gave this talk to another group that wasn't as tech savvy, so I wanted to make sure I didn't presume anything. But like, why do we care about malware? So the first thing is obviously, many of you are familiar that it's probably used for a lot of illicit activities, and these will, if you've seen the news lately, you've seen things like ransomware showing up there. You saw the Mirai botnet, and all this stuff is kind of, caused by malware that we see. But one of the things that maybe people aren't as familiar with is that a lot of the malware that we see is also collected, and we use that to build defenses. So we'll do a lot of types of malware analysis to kind of figure out what malware is actually doing. And so if you look at malware analysis, basically what we're looking at is trying to figure out what is the functionality and potential impact of the malware that we're actually seeing out in the wild. And there are a couple ways that we can do this. One is static analysis, where we're not actually trying to run the binaries. We're trying to reverse engineer them by looking at the code, maybe looking at, trying to reverse engineer them. So if you're familiar with like IDA-Pro and other things, maybe that's one method that we're doing it. Another case is, we're not going to try to do that sophisticated reverse engineering of the malware. We're just going to run it in a, dynamic execution environment and look at what the malware is actually doing. We're going to look at what it's calling out to on the network, what syscalls is it making, et cetera. And so that's how we're going to actually do this analysis. And the reason why this is important is that a lot of the indicators of compromise that we are extracting from malware is coming from this kind of malware analysis. And so, mo malware, mo problems. One of the things that we're seeing is that there are a lot of cyber attacks that are on the rise. At the center of a lot of these has been malware. So I mean, if you're familiar with Mirai, the IoT botnet that we saw last year, that was malware based. If you've been keeping up with like a lot of the ransomware stuff, that's malware based as well. And so you would think that we're getting all these samples, we're collecting more and more samples every year. But despite access to more of these samples and the fact that we use those in security products to kind of help prevent future attacks, we're not doing that much better at preventing these things. And so maybe you're saying, well, how much malware do we have? Maybe we just don't have enough. So, in our collection, this was, the kind of the malware that we collected over about 5 years. And you can see this is log scale, so kind of hide some of the trends. But we have a vastly increasing trend of malware collection over here. Over this 5-year period, we collected maybe a little more than 30 million malware samples, and some of those we didn't use because they didn't have network signal, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's also this little gap here around, I guess, 2014, and unfortunately we didn't solve security there. We just screwed up and didn't collect data right. Oops, our bad. But the question that we were really trying to answer here was, all right, we're using all these indicators of compromise from malware, and we're waiting on the malware, and we're using all this malware analysis. Are the things that we're extracting from the malware, are we using them correctly? So we have our great little guy here who's really understands how to use his favorite weapon there. It's the crossbow rifle. It's fantastic. And so this is where our study came into play. So what did we do? In this study is that we basically looked at network signal extracted from malware over about a half decade. And when we did that, we were trying to understand a couple things. The first thing, is malware effective for use with early warning systems? So if we're waiting on malware and we're extracting signals from that specifically network signal, can we use that network signal to try to detect, new threats earlier? So if we're waiting on malware and we're getting this, is this useful for preventing future threats? The second thing that we're looking at here are, what are the limitations of systems that rely on samples for defense? So if we're extracting indicators, of compromise, or we're extracting network signal from this malware, are there things that we're doing with them that really aren't good fits? And so going to talk a little bit about the data set that we used. One was we had malware execution. So this was, we talked about the two different types of malware analysis. This was dynamic analysis. So we had dynamic malware analysis traces that we got, and this, I said we had about a little over 30 million samples. But when we actually looked at the samples that actually had some sort of network signal, specifically DNS, we saw this reduce that down to about 27 million. So a lot of them, they were run and they didn't have any network signal in them at all. And if you've worked with these dynamic sandbox environments for running malware like that, what you'll notice is that often they'll run for like a period of 5 minutes, and if the right things aren't triggered, maybe the malware doesn't do anything. So in a lot of these cases, we might have had malware that we just didn't hit the right thing to trigger the right behavior. But for the ones we did, and we did have network samples, that was about 27 million. The next thing we did was we got virus total reports for all of these 27 million samples. And we looked for, and that came back to about 24 million. So there were about 3 million in here that we didn't have virus total reports for. And then the last thing is we wanted to compare this with some real world network data to say, where can we find these indicators that we're getting from malware in real world network data? So we had a passive DNS data set that we got from a major US ISP in North America, and we could use that to kind of compare what we saw in malware to when we actually saw it in the real world. And so the first thing we kind of did was, we went from, we have the samples, we have the binary, we have the hashes of the binaries, we have these virus total reports. We wanted to basically do some classification on this. And we wanted to be able to cluster like the AV labels from this malware to say, these all belong to the same family, and beyond that, these are a specific type. And I'll talk a little bit more about the specific types that we classified in just a second. But we're going to use this to provide extra content or extra context for later analysis. But if you've ever looked at the labels that you see from VirusTotal, you'll notice that like for a specific family, you might have like something like IoT Reaper dot something blah 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 2, and then one that's like IoT Reaper. So everybody has their own kind of slightly different naming scheme for these AV label vendors. So one of the goals of this was to make those consistent. So we actually modified a public project, one of our collaborators was actually the person who was behind it. We modified it to spit out not only to do this clustering, but also to spit out a type for each of the sample as well. We ran this over the 24 million samples in our database, and to our knowledge, this is the largest such study that's been done for this kind of malware clustering like that to date. And so when we did that, we saw the following. So we split out into the type where it was either malware, potentially unwanted programs, or it was unknown. We didn't have a clear delineation whether it was one of those previous two categories. And so the distinction between malware and potentially unwanted programs, this is one that the AV vendors make. And so the potentially unwanted programs might be things that are kind of like really aggressive adware or maybe spyware, or things that like, are more grayware-ish than, things that are clearly bad. So we were able to break this distinction out. And what you see here is, again, we have our collection issue there. We didn't just stop seeing less malware in 2014, but you'll notice that in 2015, the amount of potentially unwanted programs that we saw actually overtook the amount of malware that we actually saw in our collection feeds. And we had several different feeds, so this is kind of an interesting artifact that we're seeing this increase in these potentially unwanted programs over time, and less like pure malware, at least in the feeds that we have. So the next thing that I want to draw your attention to is, we did this classification where we now have the families clustered. And so what did that kind of lead us to find? Well, one of the things that we found was that if you looked at the top families by sample, what you saw is that there are actually more malware families, but the malware families tend to have fewer samples in each family. But when we looked at potentially unwanted programs, we found that they tend to have more samples per family. So there's a greater degree of kind of like binary polymorphism there that we're seeing in these PUP variants, more so than what we're seeing in these kind of malware variants. The next thing that we kind of saw was we looked to see, well, what about the network signal that these binaries are reaching out to? And with this, what we saw is that the malware families tended to actually have more domains that they reached out to, indicating a greater degree of domain polymorphism, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But basically, the idea here is that these samples actually reach out to more network signal in the potentially unwanted programs had fewer domains and other network endpoints that they reached out to. And so if you've ever looked at like malware data sets, one of the things that you'll probably notice is that they can be kind of dirty. So if you've looked at like network traces from malware, you'll notice that it's not just bad stuff that's in there. There's a lot of other stuff that you see. And so one of the first things we needed to do before we kind of delved even further into this study was kind of clean up some of these data sets. So I'll walk you through a couple of the things that we did, because I think these are valuable if this is something that you're actually going to do. Maybe these are some ideas that you can take with you. The one is we wanted to remove invalid domains. So you'll see that there are a number of resolutions that people attempt to do, that malware attempts to do, and they'll attempt to resolve domains that don't exist yet. And often this is because of things called behavior for domain generation algorithms, where they're trying to generate new domains on the fly that maybe the attacker has a DGA in the malware, and that domain hasn't been registered yet and it just doesn't exist, or something like that. Or maybe it's they're reaching out to an expired domain, which if you saw a talk earlier, they talked about that as well. The next thing is we tried to remove benign domains. So malware doesn't just reach out to bad domains. Malware does reach out to good domains as well. Sometimes this might be to test if there's network connectivity. So they might reach out to Google or other things to see, yes, I have a network connection, now I'm going to reach out to something else. Or you might also see the case where like a legitimate application has been repackaged with some malicious behavior thrown in there, so it still reaches out to all the good stuff that the regular application reached out to. The next thing that we kind of removed was these spam domains. So what was interesting about this is that we had a lot of samples that looked like they were just facilitating spam, and we didn't really want to measure behavior that was associated with spam because we were looking at network signal. We wanted to focus on things that were more related to malware and the infrastructure that malware was using for maybe dropping or getting doing command and control for botnets and things like that, and less about sending lots and lots of email spam. So we filtered all out of the spam domains. And then the last thing we did was, because of the way that these executions happen, they're happening in this dynamic execution environment, often running on a specific platform. And one of the artifacts of that is that you might see that there are a lot of reverse zone delegation or reverse pointer lookups when they're connecting directly to an IP. The underlying operating system might do a reverse pointer lookup to see if there's a domain associated with that IP. And this is actually not caused by the malware, but the underlying system. So we tried to remove that out as well. So basically, we wanted only the stuff left to be associated with really malware communication. And this was kind of the goal of all this filtering. And so I mentioned domain polymorphism earlier, so I'll talk a little bit more about what we meant by that now. So we have a domain. It's a very clever named domain. This is an example domain, so subdomain.example.com. We have a domain where the registered domain is example.com, and it's got a child label, subdomain. And what we saw was that most malware samples resolve fewer than 10 unique fully qualified domains. So everything highlighted in red, that's what most domains resolved, or most malware samples actually resolved that. But when we actually looked at the registered domain, which is kind of badly highlighted up there, we noticed that most registered domains were only queried by a single malware sample. So what we're seeing here is that for most malware, they weren't doing evasion on the child label, like by just adding subdomain 1, subdomain 2, subdomain 3. We're seeing that in most cases, they just registered a whole new domain. So if you're blocking specific child labels, or even a specific registered domain, what we're seeing here is that that might not be super effective. So if you're building blacklists from these indicators of compromise extracted from this kind of malware analysis, it might be kind of futile in preventing future threats. It might be preventing the one that you knew about in the future, for communication back to that, but communication from future malware samples, maybe not so much. And this is something to be aware of if you're actually relying on the malware to kind of block future threats. The next thing I want to talk about is one of the trends we saw related to dynamic DNS. And what we saw here was that a lot of before we said the evasions tend to happen on the registered domain, the way dynamic DNS works is it allows you to go to a provider. You can register as many child labels as you want under some registered domain owned by the DNS provider. So maybe it's in the case here we have this this case over the most popular case over here, which is dnsd.me. So you might register, mydomain.dnsd.me. And you could register as many child labels as you want. So in this case, if you were trying to evade detection, you would do that by just picking a lot of child labels. But you couldn't, and if you were a defender, you couldn't just block the registered domain because there are going to be a lot of legitimate cases of use that rely on that domain as well. One of the challenges here, though, is that we saw that a lot of malware samples actually rely on DNS. And this can make it very hard to block some of that communication because you can't just block the registered domain owned by the dynamic DNS provider. And then you're playing a game of whack-a-mole with the child labels. And we saw that about 32% of all the samples in our data set actually made queries to DNS providers. And in fact, the most popular DNS provider up here, the dnsd.me, this was an interesting case. This was a totally free DNS provider. I think there were, I think it was queried by like 200,000 unique MD5s, somewhere like that. So a lot of samples were actually relying on that particular domain hosted by that provider, and that's just one provided by that provider. But that provider was interesting because totally free provider. They provided APIs for registering new accounts and registering domains. So everything could be completely automated. It was completely free, and that was kind of their big thing. So there wasn't much protection for abuse, and it looks like that was being heavily used for abuse. The next thing we looked at was, well, if malware does actually query CDNs, which CDNs do they actually query? And so again, what we're seeing here that was kind of unusual is that malware just uses the same popular CDNs that everything else uses. So if you're expecting like a shady CDN provider to be used by malware, that's not what we were actually seeing for the vast majority of cases of malware. We saw that they were just commonly relying on the more popular CDN providers that you'd expect benign, legitimate applications to be using. And so ultimately what that meant is that this malware communication is ultimately hiding in plain sight. So there's, the infrastructure associated with these CDNs is, not necessarily suspicious or anything like that. So if you're looking for, using the reputation of the infrastructure, the reputation of the domains that are being used, that's kind of more challenging here because it's just hiding in plain sight. We also we mentioned DGA domains earlier. So one of the things that we looked at was, how often are DGAs used in malware? And well, we saw that we mentioned that like the NX domains were one kind of indicator that there might be a DGA there, and we saw that about half of the samples that we had in our data set made at least one, had queried at least one domain that was an NX domain, so it didn't exist yet. And this is interesting because that means that almost half of all of our samples were reaching out to something that could be a DGA. But then what we actually saw was that before we did any of the filtering, when we removed the NX domains, we saw that we used another data set called the DGA archive. It's got about 50 million domains that have been generated from known DGAs. So there were some researchers that reverse engineered the binaries, got the DGAs out, and then generated a whole crap ton, that's a very technical term, of domains. And when we saw that there were about 3 million of all the domains were in DGA archive. So about half of these, there were half of all the domains that we extracted from malware were actually DGA related. And that's just from known DGAs. So some of those other ones that we don't know could be other DGAs. So a lot of DGA usage, which also has implications on how you can use these domains. If it's a DGA domain, then you block one, they're probably just going to go to use the next one because they saw that you blocked that one. After filtering, we still found that about 17% of the remaining domains were in the DGA archive, so they were known DGA domains. So in general, we saw this kind of increasing trend of DGA domains. So the efficacy of blacklisting or doing DNS-based blacklisting of domains, if you're extracting that from malware, is maybe not so effective for preventing future malware, or even existing malware if they're using a DGA. The other thing we saw was that we looked at we filtered them out for a lot of the other, for some of the other measurements I'll show you later, but we wanted to see what the samples that were actually doing kind of querying spam related domains were actually doing. And so one of the things we saw was that most of the spam-related samples were creating hundreds of thousands of unique domains. So whereas we saw on average most malware samples queried maybe less than 10 and maybe only a single registered domain per malware sample, we saw that these were bucking that trend and were using lots and lots and lots of different domains. So they had a very distinctly different behavior from most of the other malware that we saw. And the other thing I'll draw your attention to is that the most popular related malware, spam-related malware sample that we saw in our data set is this MyDoom family. And what we saw here is that this sample is over a decade old, and we're still finding those show up in our spam feeds. So remediation, I think the takeaway here is remediation is hard. We know about this sample, we've known about it for a decade, and we're still not that good at keeping this off the internet. People are still finding it and submitting it to feeds, and we're still getting new variants or whatever of this particular sample. So this next slide is maybe one of the more interesting results that we have in this paper. And I say this because the results were kind of surprising. We collaborated with a number of different researchers. Some of them were very malware focused, and that was their general field of study. And we spent a lot of time going through these results because they found them surprising. We were a little surprised. But basically what this shows is when do we first, how long is the delay between when we see malware in the wild, or we think we see malware in the wild, and when we actually discover it and it's shows up in one of these kind of malware feeds. And in the ideal case, what we would see on one of these plots here is that at 0, that would be the same day that we found the malware is the same day that we saw it in the wild, on the network, communicating back to some command and control or some sort of remote entity. And so 0 would be the ideal case. But what we actually see here is that there's this long tail on the left, which indicates that in many cases, we're seeing this malware active weeks to months before we're actually finding it in the spam feeds or in these malware feeds. So if we're waiting for the malware to be discovered, we're waiting a long time, much longer than we thought we were probably going to be waiting to actually discover it. And then in the next, so there could be a number of reasons for that, right? So maybe this is a case where this was a malware took a domain that it was previously online, and that domain expired, and then malware started using it to perform abuse. So really that previous communication wasn't indicative that there was actually an infection in the network, but we tried to kind of remove that because we had done a previous study looking at that kind of behavior. And so we removed cases where we saw a known expiration, and we said that expiration date from then on was the first point we had ever seen that, and then looked to see whether it was created by malware. And when we did that, there was a little bit of a shift, but we still had this long tail on the left. And that long tail on the left just didn't go away. And what we noticed is that there was a change on the right, but this just indicated that in these cases we saw the network communication after we saw the malware. So it had an effect. It just didn't reduce that left-hand side, which is what we were ultimately hoping it would do. So you're seeing that we're still seeing malware active in the wild well before we see it in one of the malware feeds. The other thing that we saw that we looked at was, well, what about blacklists? So are we seeing stuff show up in blacklists before we actually get the malware feed? So if so, maybe that's the malware feeds or the public blacklists are doing a good enough job of keeping the stuff in the malware off the network, and we don't need to worry too much about it. What we saw is it did reduce it, but we still have a lot of cases where we're seeing things weeks to months. We're getting the malware weeks to months after we see it show up on a public blacklist, indicating that if we're waiting for the malware again, it's a little bit late, and we still have this kind of tail on the right, which isn't so good. So really the kind of takeaway here was that we were surprised that if you're waiting for the malware, you're often going to have a large window of vulnerability where you're susceptible to this malware out in the wild. So the next thing we looked at was, all right, well, so maybe I saw a resolution once, in that previous plot, and that was indicating that I saw the malware active for some period before we actually discovered the malware, but it wasn't really that active. It was active in a very small number of cases, and it wasn't indicative of like a persistent infection. So what we did was we looked at kind of the lifetime of these domains to see how often were they looked up, and also how frequently were they looked up. So were they looked up like once over a period of 365 days, or were they looked up like every day over a period of 365 days? And so what we saw here was that there were several pockets of abuse. There was kind of this bottom left-hand corner, which was, they were looked up relatively frequently for a smaller period of time. In some cases, it's not that small. It's maybe several hundred days. In other cases, in the right-hand corner over there, or bottom right, what we saw is that these were cases where they were looked up very infrequently over a longer period of time. So maybe they were looked up once over a year. And then this top right-hand corner was maybe perhaps the most interesting case, which is there were a lot of these that were looked up very frequently over years. And this was after we had seen the infection and everything. So like these were cases where they just weren't being remediated very well. So this could be things like we're just not doing a good job remediating. The other thing is, if you look at the lifetime of malware versus the potentially unwanted programs, you'll notice they look a lot different. The potentially unwanted programs tend to be very active during the entire lifetime in general. And then the last thing I'll point out is that if you looked at the similarities between the malware in the unknown class, you'll notice they look very similar. So we said we had 3 classes. This kind of suggests that maybe that unknown class was closer to malware than it was the potentially unwanted programs. Then the last thing that I'll kind of discuss is when we looked at the infrastructure that they were resolving to. And this basically what this shows is the /24 that things were resolving into. So we're looking at the basically subnets that we saw most of the traffic resolving to, and you'll notice that there are kind of these pockets where there's a lot of abuse going on, and they're labeled M for a malware family, P is for PUP, and then it's not on this one, but on some of the, I'll show you some other plots where there were actually some that were related to sinkholes. But what we're seeing here is that this is over the course of a year. So over 2012, there were certain portions of the internet that were far more likely to be looked up by a malware family than any other places. So these were kind of like pockets of abuse that we saw active on the internet. And if you look at this, we actually saw that these pockets of abuse sometimes were kind of stable, but often would change year to year. So you'll notice that, again, we still see lots of different pockets of abuse, and you'll see that some are relatively small and they're changing very frequently, but some are very stable over the course of the year. PUP in particular seemed to use very stable infrastructure, and sometimes that stable infrastructure was hosted on things like Akamai, so they were using CDNs and other things to actually host the malicious behavior that they were doing, or at least provide some resiliency. It also kind of had the added benefit that it's hiding in plain sight, because you can't just block Akamai infrastructure. I think people would probably get kind of mad. So some of the kind of key takeaways that I just want to discuss are, if you're waiting for malware to be discovered, this can result in kind of these long windows of vulnerability. So we saw that sometimes that was weeks to months. And if you're using the indicators of compromise from these malware samples, sometimes that can result in potentially limited efficacy. So one of the things that we do a lot in our lab is look at network defenses, and in many cases, some of the things that we saw that were in the malware, we had other techniques that we saw were able to discover those sooner. So network defenses have some potential to identify some of these threats before the samples have even been discovered. So if you're looking for ways to kind of look for infections on the network, there's some other techniques you can use to maybe find this before you get the malware and not rely on just waiting for the malware. And last is that while I've said there are limitations to this, the malware analysis is still extremely useful. I'm not saying it's not useful, but I'm just saying it's important to understand those limitations. And that was one of the things that we kind of got a better understanding of in this study. And I guess, thank you. Yeah. All right. Oh yeah, over.
So in your study, I saw there's PUP. Were you looking at PUP morphing into actual like exploits like rats and things, or is that not part of the study?
That wasn't really part of this study. We're doing some follow-on work where we may look into that more. We're starting to look into some of the behavior to explain why we're seeing that kind of gap between when we first started to see single network and actually the malware samples. So we're trying to better understand that and also kind of figure out are we seeing certain samples target certain sectors more frequently than others. So that could go along, that kind of understanding could go along in the future work.
So 2 questions. One is so you used Alexa as a whitelist domain set to kind of wash the data before you started analyzing it. Did you account for any of the mainstream data domains that get used as C2, like Twitter, for example, or is that kind of a hole in the data?
So that would be one of those challenges where it's like it's hard for us to distinguish at this level what would be legit Twitter lookups versus like non-legit, because we didn't have we're not looking at URIs or any data that was actually in the request, so that's kind of a limitation. And it's one of the things where if you're, a lot of defenses will actually look at, just using, some sort of blacklisting, and if you're relying on that, you'll miss that obviously, but you also just kind of have the other, limitation where we saw that, doing those blocking isn't really that effective at blocking future samples.
Yep. And then a follow-up question, a little less serious. Are you the person at Georgia Tech that keeps uploading Dexter samples to VirusTotal?
If I am, I'm not aware of it. Maybe, I would love to claim credit for that because I think that'd be, I don't know, maybe cool, but no. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
A question about, I've seen MyDoom a lot in AV signature hits on stuff that I know is not MyDoom. You guys classified that as MyDoom yourself with your own VirusTotal signature, or are you relying on?
So we did look at some of the samples. There weren't, so while we found a lot of that particular sample, there weren't that many of them. So we tried to verify some of them just to make sure that it looked legit. There were like 10,000 samples in there, so we didn't verify all of them, but the ones we did look at did look like MyDoom.
So you are going on AV classifications rather than your own classification?
We went on the AV classifications there. We tried to, so one of the things that the AV class clustering did was it would try to weight things as, if they got several different classifications in there, because you have a bunch of different AV vendors. Not all of them will rate it as MyDoom. So that's one of the things that the clustering kind of tried to clean up a little bit, was so that if there were multiple things that it was labeled as, we didn't just pick it as MyDoom because it had MyDoom in there. It was this was the one that was MyDoom was the most likely one there. And in some manual analysis of those clusters, it seemed to do a good job, but I can't say with 100% certainty that all 10,000 of those were MyDoom. But
I noticed you didn't have backdoor.trojan in there, and that's a quite popular classification for.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you guys make any effort to dedupe samples because we've seen submitters that will take the same piece of malware, add a little float value or something in, and just submit it over and over again to VT, for example. Was there any effort to kind of dedupe those?
So I mean, the dedupe that we had basically happen was mostly just, so we didn't see, it was mostly just hash based. So beyond that, we weren't looking at anything to look for that kind of behavior. We were just seeing what's coming into the malware feeds that we had access to. So we had 3 different ones. One of them was a public feed, one of them was a commercial feed, and one of them was run by our university. And so that's where our feeds were coming from. And there wasn't much overlap between our feeds. So yeah, so I mean, that's a potential limitation for sure. All right, well, I guess thank you.